Rome, the eternal city, the heart of an empire that once ruled the known world with unmatched power, culture, and innovation. But then it fell. Or did it? For centuries, historians have debated the reasons behind the collapse of one of history's greatest civilizations. Was it barbarian invasions, economic decay, political corruption, or something far more complex and far more shocking that many mainstream accounts conveniently overlook? Today, we're diving deep into the real story behind Rome's fall. Not the sanitized textbook version you've heard 1,000 times, but the hidden truths that challenge everything you thought you knew. Prepare yourself for a journey through intrigue, conspiracy, and the unraveling of an empire that still echoes in our modern world. Let's start with the popular narrative. Most people believe Rome fell in 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This moment is often portrayed as the definitive end of the Western Roman Empire, a sudden collapse triggered by relentless barbarian invasions. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, the Vandals in 455 AD, and finally the Ostrogoths took over Italy. It's a story of external forces overwhelming a weakened empire. But this version is too neat, too simple. It ignores the centuries of internal decay, the political machinations, and the economic shifts that set the stage for Rome's downfall long before the barbarians arrived at the gates. It also overlooks the fact that the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 years after 476 AD, preserving Roman law, culture, and governance. So, what really happened? To understand, we need to peel back the layers of history and look at the empire from multiple angles: political, economic, social, and military. Only then can we grasp the full picture. First, consider the political instability that plagued Rome in its final centuries. The empire was no longer governed by strong, visionary leaders, but by a revolving door of emperors, many of whom were puppets controlled by powerful generals or corrupt officials. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome experienced the crisis of the 3rd century, a period marked by nearly 50 emperors in just 50 years. Civil wars, assassinations, and power struggles became the norm. This chaos weakened the central authority and made it difficult to respond effectively to external threats. But why did this political chaos erupt? One key factor was the sheer size of the empire. Stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia, Rome was vast beyond comprehension. Communication was slow, and local governors often acted with near-complete autonomy. This decentralization made it easier for ambitious generals to seize power, but it also fractured the unity of the empire. Emperor Diocletian tried to fix this by dividing the empire into East and West in 285 AD, each ruled by its own emperor under a system called the Tetrarchy. This was meant to improve governance and defense, but it also created new rivalries and divisions. The East, richer and more stable, thrived, while the West struggled with economic decline and constant invasions. Speaking of economics, Rome's financial troubles were a ticking bomb. The empire's economy was heavily reliant on conquest and plunder. As expansion slowed and eventually stopped, the flow of wealth dried up. Without new territories to tax, the government faced mounting expenses, paying armies, maintaining infrastructure, and supporting a sprawling bureaucracy. To cover these costs, emperors resorted to heavy taxation, which burdened the common people and stifled economic growth. Inflation soared as emperors debased the currency, mixing precious metals with cheaper metals to mint more coins. This led to a loss of confidence in money and a decline in trade. Agriculture, the backbone of the Roman economy, also suffered. Large estates owned by wealthy elites dominated the countryside, often worked by tenant farmers or slaves. Small farmers were pushed out, leading to rural depopulation and food shortages. This created social unrest and weakened the empire's ability to sustain its population and armies.
Now, let's talk about the military, the supposed backbone of Rome's power. The Roman legions were legendary, but by the late Empire, their effectiveness had diminished. Recruitment became difficult as fewer Roman citizens were willing or able to serve. The army increasingly relied on barbarian mercenaries, who were often less loyal and sometimes turned against Rome. Moreover, the military was stretched thin, defending a vast and porous border against multiple enemies. The famous limes, fortified frontiers, were breached repeatedly. The empire's enemies were not just barbarians, but also rival powers like the Sassanid Persians in the east. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn. Recent scholarship suggests that the barbarian invasions were not simply waves of violent outsiders smashing into Rome. Instead, many so-called barbarians were actually integrated into Roman society as foederati, federated allies who fought alongside Roman troops and settled within the empire's borders. This blurs the line between Roman and barbarian. The empire was no longer a monolithic entity, but a complex mosaic of peoples and cultures. The fall of Rome was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation, a fusion of Roman and barbarian elements that gave birth to medieval Europe. So, why do many historians still emphasize the barbarian invasion narrative? Partly because it's chromatic and easy to understand, but also because it serves political and cultural agendas. The idea of a glorious civilization destroyed by outsiders fits certain nationalist and ideological narratives. The truth is messier and more nuanced. Rome didn't fall because of a single cause or event. It fell because of a combination of internal weaknesses and external pressures, a slow unraveling that took centuries. And yet, even in its decline, Rome's legacy endured. Its laws, language, architecture, and ideas shaped the future of Europe and the Western world. The fall of Rome was not the end, but a transformation, a shocking truth that challenges the simplistic stories we've been told. As we continue, we'll explore these themes in greater detail, uncovering the hidden forces and forgotten facts that reveal why Rome really fell. Stay with me because the story you're about to hear will change the way you see history forever.
The famous Roman discipline and training standards eroded, and the once feared legions became vulnerable to defeat. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD shocked the world precisely because it shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. But here's the paradox. Despite these military weaknesses, Rome was not defenseless. The empire had formidable fortifications, a network of roads for rapid troop movement, and a complex intelligence system. The problem was not just external enemies, but internal disunity and mismanagement. This brings us to the role of leadership and governance in the empire's fall. The emperors of the late empire faced impossible challenges: economic crises, military threats, social upheaval, and religious transformation. Some tried to reform the system, but their efforts were often too little, too late. Diocletian's tetrarchy was an ambitious attempt to stabilize the empire by sharing power among 4 rulers. It temporarily brought order, but also sowed seeds of division. Constantine reunited the empire and established Constantinople as a new capital, shifting the center of power eastward. This eastward shift had profound consequences. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its wealthier cities and stronger economy, became the dominant force. The Western Empire, poorer and more vulnerable, was left to fend for itself. The Western emperors became figureheads, controlled by powerful generals and barbarian kings. The Senate in Rome lost much of its influence, and local rulers gained autonomy. The central government's ability to enforce laws and collect taxes diminished.
Corruption and incompetence plagued the administration. Officials often enriched themselves at the expense of the state, and the bureaucracy became bloated and inefficient. This eroded public trust and made it harder to mobilize resources in times of crisis. In this context, the barbarian invasions were not just external attacks, but also symptoms of deeper systemic failures. Groups like the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths were pushed into Roman territory by pressures from other tribes and the expanding Huns. They sought refuge, land, and opportunity within the empire's borders. Rome's response was inconsistent, sometimes welcoming these groups as allies, other times fighting them fiercely. This inconsistent policy reflected the empire's weakened state and inability to control its frontiers effectively. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by the Visigoths under Alaric was a watershed moment. It was the first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign enemy. The psychological impact was enormous, shaking the confidence of Romans and their allies. Yet, Rome did not collapse immediately. The empire continued for decades, struggling to maintain order and authority. The final blow came in 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. But by then, the empire was already a shadow of its former self. So, what is the shocking truth historians hide? It's that Rome didn't fall because of a single catastrophic event or a simple invasion. It fell because of a complex web of internal decay, social transformation, economic hardship, military challenges, and shifting identities. The empire's fall was a process, not an event. It was a transformation from a centralized, unified state to a fragmented, multicultural landscape that laid the foundation for medieval Europe. Understanding this complexity challenges the simplistic narratives that dominate popular history. It forces us to reconsider what we mean by fall and to appreciate the resilience and adaptability of Roman civilization. As we move forward, we'll explore some of the lesser-known players and events that shaped this transformation. We'll uncover the roles of key figures, the impact of cultural shifts, and the surprising continuities that survived the collapse of the empire. Stay tuned, because the story of Rome's fall is far from over, and the truths you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew.
To truly grasp why Rome fell, we must look beyond the surface and examine the social fabric of the empire in its final centuries. The Roman world was not just a political and military entity, it was a complex society with deep divisions, shifting identities, and growing tensions that eroded its cohesion from within. One of the most overlooked factors in Rome's decline is the transformation of its social classes and the widening gap between the elite and the common people. The Roman aristocracy, once a vibrant and influential class of landowners, politicians, and military leaders, became increasingly detached from the realities faced by ordinary citizens. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, who lived in opulent villas and enjoyed privileges that the majority could only dream of. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the population, farmers, artisans, laborers, and soldiers, struggled to survive. Economic hardships, heavy taxation, and the constant threat of war created a climate of fear and uncertainty. The traditional Roman values of civic duty, discipline, and public service began to erode as people focused on personal survival and self-interest. This social fragmentation was exacerbated by the rise of Christianity, which fundamentally altered the cultural and religious landscape of the empire. For centuries, Rome had been a polytheistic society, with a pantheon of gods and a strong emphasis on rituals that reinforced loyalty to the state. The emperor himself was often worshipped as a divine figure, symbolizing the unity and power of Rome. But as Christianity spread, it introduced a new worldview, one that emphasized spiritual salvation over earthly power. humility over pride, and a universal brotherhood that transcended ethnic and social boundaries. This shift challenged the traditional Roman order and created tensions between the old pagan elite and the growing Christian population. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century was a turning point. Christianity became the state religion, and pagan practices were increasingly suppressed. While this helped unify the empire under a single faith, it also alienated many who clung to the old ways. The cultural transformation was profound and unsettling, contributing to a sense of identity crisis within the empire. At the same time, the Christian church grew into a powerful institution, rivaling the state in influence. Bishops and clergy wielded significant authority, often mediating between the people and the government. This shift in power dynamics sometimes undermined imperial authority and complicated governance. Another critical social issue was the decline of the Roman family structure and population. Birth rates fell, and the empire faced demographic challenges. Wars, plagues, and economic instability took their toll, reducing the pool of able-bodied men available for military service and labor. The empire's ability to replenish its ranks and sustain its economy was severely compromised. Slavery, a cornerstone of the Roman economy, also began to wane. As conquests slowed, the supply of new slaves diminished. This forced landowners and businesses to adapt, but it also disrupted established economic patterns. The reliance on slave labor had created a rigid social hierarchy that was difficult to change. Meanwhile, the rural countryside, once the backbone of Roman agriculture, was in decline. Large estates dominated by wealthy landowners replaced small farms, but many estates were neglected or abandoned due to insecurity and lack of labor. This led to food shortages and increased dependence on grain imports, which were vulnerable to disruption. Urban centers, too, faced challenges. Cities like Rome, once bustling hubs of commerce and culture, experienced population decline, infrastructure decay, and rising crime. The grandeur of Roman architecture and public works could not mask the growing poverty and social unrest beneath the surface. All these social changes created a society that was fragmented, anxious, and less resilient. The bonds that had held Rome together for centuries were fraying, making it harder to respond to external threats or internal crises. Now, let's turn to the military once more, but from a different angle. The Roman army was not just a fighting force, it was a social institution that shaped the empire's identity and stability. Soldiers were often landowners, citizens, and symbols of Roman power. But by the late empire, this connection weakened. Recruitment problems forced the army to rely heavily on barbarian mercenaries and foederati, as mentioned earlier. These groups were often loyal to their own leaders rather than the Roman state. While they provided much-needed manpower, their presence sometimes led to divided loyalties and internal conflicts. Moreover, the army's role shifted from expansion and conquest to defense and maintenance. The legions became more static, guarding borders rather than pushing them outward. This defensive posture reflected the empire's changing fortunes, but also limited opportunities for glory and wealth that had motivated soldiers in earlier times. The quality of leadership in the military also declined. Many commanders were appointed for political reasons rather than merit, leading to ineffective strategies and poor morale. Corruption and bribery were rampant, further weakening the army's effectiveness.
To truly understand the fall of Rome, we must also examine the role of external pressures, not just as simple invasions, but as complex interactions between Rome and the so-called barbarian peoples. The traditional story paints these groups as savage hordes who destroyed Roman civilization, but the reality is far more intricate and revealing. The term barbarian itself is a Roman invention, used to describe anyone outside the empire's borders who did not speak Latin or Greek and did not follow Roman customs. But these groups, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, and others, were not monolithic enemies. They were diverse peoples with their own cultures, politics, and ambitions. Many had long histories of interaction with Rome, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, traitors, or mercenaries. One of the most misunderstood groups were the Visigoths. Initially, they were a branch of the larger Gothic peoples who lived north of the Danube River. Pressured by the expansion of the Huns, the Visigoths sought refuge within the Roman Empire in the late 4th century. The Romans allowed them to settle as foederati, expecting them to serve as allies and soldiers in exchange for land and protection. However, the relationship was fraught with tension. Roman officials often mistreated the Visigoths, exploiting them and failing to provide promised supplies. This mistreatment led to rebellion and conflict, culminating in the famous Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where the Roman army suffered a devastating defeat. This battle is often cited as a turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for Roman military dominance. The Visigoths, under their leader Alaric, eventually marched on Rome itself, sacking the city in 410 AD. This event shocked the Roman world, but it was not a mindless destruction. Alaric sought recognition and a place for his people within the empire's structure. The sack was as much a political statement as a military action. Similarly, the Vandals crossed into Roman territory and established a kingdom in North Africa. Their control of the grain supply to Rome was a strategic blow to the empire's food security. The Vandals also sacked Rome in 455 AD, further undermining the city's prestige. The Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, were another major external pressure. Unlike the settled barbarian groups, the Huns were nomadic warriors from Central Asia who pushed other tribes into Roman lands. Their invasions destabilized the region and forced Rome to divert resources to defense. But here's the crucial point. These groups were not simply destroyers, they were also inheritors and transformers of Roman culture. Many barbarian leaders adopted Roman titles, laws, and customs. The Visigothic Code, for example, blended Roman legal principles with Gothic traditions. This blending of cultures was part of a larger process of transformation. The fall of Rome was not a clean break, but a gradual evolution. The Western Roman Empire gave way to a patchwork of successor kingdoms that preserved many Roman institutions while adapting to new realities. This process is sometimes called the barbarization of the Roman world, but it's more accurate to see it as a fusion, a complex cultural and political synthesis that laid the groundwork for medieval Europe. Another external factor often overlooked is the role of climate and environmental changes. Recent studies suggest that shifts in climate patterns during the late Roman period contributed to agricultural decline, food shortages, and population movements. Droughts, colder temperatures, and changing rainfall patterns affected crop yields and livestock. These environmental stresses exacerbated existing economic and social problems, making it harder for the empire to sustain its population and armies. Moreover, epidemics and plagues ravaged the empire. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century killed millions, weakening the labor force and military recruitment. Disease outbreaks continued sporadically, further destabilizing society. These natural factors combined with human-made crises to create a perfect storm. Rome was not just fighting enemies on its borders, but battling the very environment and health of its people. Now, let's shift focus to the intellectual and cultural dimensions of Rome's fall. The empire was a beacon of learning, philosophy, and art. Yet in its final centuries, there was a noticeable shift in intellectual life. The classical pagan traditions that had flourished for centuries gave way to Christian theology and monastic scholarship. While this preserved much knowledge, it also changed the priorities and methods of education and cultural production. Some historians argue that this shift contributed to a decline in scientific and technological innovation. The emphasis moved from worldly knowledge to spiritual matters, which affected the empire's ability to adapt and solve practical problems. However, this view is debated. Others point out that Christian institutions preserved and transmitted classical knowledge through monasteries and scriptoria, laying the foundation for the Renaissance centuries later. The transformation of Roman culture was not a loss, but a reorientation. It reflected the changing values and realities of a world in transition. Finally, we must consider the psychological impact of Rome's decline on its people. The loss of confidence in the empire's invincibility, the erosion of traditional values, and the uncertainty about the future created a collective trauma. This psychological dimension influenced political decisions, social behavior, and cultural expressions. It fueled apocalyptic literature, religious fervor, and a longing for stability and order. In many ways, the fall of Rome was as much a crisis of identity and meaning as it was a political or military event. So when we ask why Rome really fell, the answer is not a simple one. It was a multifaceted process involving internal decay, external pressures, environmental challenges, cultural transformations, and psychological shifts. The shocking truth historians often hide is that Rome's fall was not a failure, but a transformation, a complex, painful, and ongoing process that reshaped the world. As we continue, we will delve into the stories of key individuals who shaped this transformation, the myths that have obscured the truth, and the lessons we can learn from Rome's experience. Stay with me, because the real story of Rome's fall is just beginning, and it's far more fascinating and relevant than you ever imagined.
As we peel back the layers of Rome's decline, it becomes clear that the empire's fall was not just about armies clashing or emperors failing. It was about the very nature of power, identity, and survival in a changing world. To understand this, we need to look closely at some of the key figures whose actions and decisions shaped the final centuries of the empire, figures often misunderstood or deliberately obscured by history. Take Emperor Honorius, for example. He ruled the Western Roman Empire from 395 to 423 AD, a period marked by relentless barbarian pressure and internal strife. Honorius is often portrayed as weak and ineffective, a ruler who fled Rome when the Visigoths approached and left the city defenseless. But this simplistic portrayal misses the complexity of his reign. Honorius inherited an empire already in crisis, with limited resources and fractured loyalties. His court was dominated by powerful generals and officials who often acted independently or even against imperial interests. Honorius struggled to maintain control, balancing the demands of the military, the Senate, and barbarian groups within the empire. His decision to move the capital from Rome to Ravenna was strategic. Ravenna was easier to defend, surrounded by marshes and fortified walls. While this move symbolized the decline of Rome's political centrality, it also reflected a pragmatic attempt to preserve imperial authority in a safer location. Then there's Stilicho, the powerful general and regent for Honorius. Stilicho was of mixed Roman and barbarian descent, a fact that complicated his position. He was one of the last great Roman commanders who tried to defend the empire against multiple threats, including the Visigoths and the Huns. Stilicho's efforts were heroic, but ultimately unsuccessful. His execution in 408 AD amid court intrigues and accusations of treason removed a key defender of the empire. This power vacuum accelerated the empire's decline and left it vulnerable to further attacks. Another pivotal figure is Alaric, the Visigoth leader who sacked Rome in 410 AD. Alaric is often demonized as a barbarian destroyer, but his story is more nuanced. He sought recognition and a legitimate place for his people within the Roman system. His sack of Rome was a desperate act after years of failed negotiations and broken promises. Alaric's actions highlight the blurred lines between Roman and barbarian. He was both an enemy and a product of the Roman world, educated in Roman military tactics and politics. His sack of Rome was as much a political statement as a military conquest. Moving forward, we encounter Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain who deposed the last Western Roman emperor in 476 AD. Odoacer's rise to power is often seen as the definitive end of the Western Roman Empire. But Odoacer did not destroy Roman institutions. Instead, he ruled Italy as a Roman king, maintaining many aspects of Roman administration and culture. Odoacer's reign illustrates the continuity beneath the surface of Rome's fall. The empire did not vanish overnight. It transformed into new political entities that preserved Roman legacies in different forms. These individual stories reveal a pattern. Rome's fall was not a simple collapse, but a complex negotiation between old and new powers, identities, and realities. Now, let's explore the myths that have shaped our understanding of Rome's fall, myths that often obscure the truth and serve particular agendas. One of the most persistent myths is that Rome fell because of moral decay. This idea, popularized by writers like Edward Gibbon in the 18th century, suggests that Romans became decadent, lazy, and corrupt, leading to their downfall. While corruption and decadence existed, this explanation is overly simplistic and moralistic. It ignores the structural and systemic issues that played a far greater role. It also unfairly blames the victims of a complex historical process rather than analyzing the broader forces at work.
Another myth is that Rome was destroyed by barbarian hordes in a sudden, catastrophic event. As we've seen, the reality was a gradual transformation involving cooperation, assimilation, and cultural blending. These myths persist because they offer clear, dramatic narratives that are easy to understand and remember. But history is rarely so neat. Understanding the real story requires embracing complexity and ambiguity. It means recognizing that Rome's fall was a process of change, not just destruction. This leads us to the lessons Rome's fall offers us today. In an age of globalization, political polarization, and environmental challenges, the story of Rome resonates deeply. Rome's experience shows how internal divisions, economic inequality, and failure to adapt can weaken even the most powerful states. It warns us about the dangers of ignoring social cohesion and the importance of effective governance. It also reminds us that cultural transformation is inevitable and that survival often depends on the ability to integrate new ideas and peoples. Finally, Rome's fall teaches us about resilience. Despite the collapse of the Western Empire, Roman culture, law, and ideas endured and evolved, shaping the future in profound ways. As we conclude this section, remember that the fall of Rome is not just a story of loss, but of transformation and continuity. It challenges us to rethink history and to see the past as a living dialogue with the present. In the final section, we'll bring all these threads together, revealing the full picture of why Rome really fell and what it means for us today. Stay with me, because the shocking truth is about to be fully unveiled.
As we reach the final chapter of this story, it's time to bring everything into focus and confront the full, unvarnished truth about why Rome really fell. This truth is not a single cause or a simple narrative, but a tapestry woven from countless threads: political, social, economic, military, cultural, and environmental, that together reveal a civilization in transformation rather than collapse. Rome's fall was not the end of an empire, but the birth of a new world. The Western Roman Empire's political structures crumbled, yes, but the ideas, institutions, and cultural legacies of Rome endured and evolved, shaping the medieval world and beyond. One of the most important lessons is that Rome's decline was a process of adaptation and change, not just failure. The empire faced unprecedented challenges: barbarian migrations, economic shifts, religious transformations, and environmental pressures, and responded in ways that were sometimes effective, sometimes flawed, but always complex. The empire's political fragmentation, often seen as a weakness, was also a form of decentralization that allowed local powers to emerge and adapt to new realities. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule in the West were not destroyers, but inheritors and transformers of Roman civilization. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, preserved Roman law, culture, and governance for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West. This continuity challenges the idea of a fall as a total collapse, and instead suggests a transformation of power and identity. Economically, Rome's reliance on conquest and plunder was unsustainable, but the empire's trade networks, urban centers, and agricultural systems laid the groundwork for future economic development in Europe. Socially, the rise of Christianity reshaped the empire's values and institutions, creating new forms of community and authority that would dominate the medieval world. The church became a unifying force amid political fragmentation, preserving knowledge and providing social services. Militarily, the Roman legion's decline was offset by new forms of defense and alliance, including the integration of barbarian groups as foederati. This blending of peoples and cultures was a hallmark of the post-Roman world. Environmentally, climate change and disease played crucial roles in weakening the empire's foundations, reminding us that human history is deeply intertwined with natural forces. Psychologically and culturally, the loss of Rome's invincibility was a profound shock,
But it also sparked new religious and philosophical movements that sought meaning in a changing world. The shocking truth historians hide is that Rome's fall was not a failure, but a transformation, a complex, multifaceted process that defies simple explanations. It was a story of resilience, adaptation, and continuity amid change. This truth has profound implications for us today. In a world facing political upheaval, economic uncertainty, cultural shifts, and environmental crises, the story of Rome offers both warnings and hope. It warns us about the dangers of internal division, economic inequality, and failure to adapt. It shows how even the mightiest powers can falter if they lose social cohesion and effective governance. But it also offers hope. Rome's legacy endured because it was flexible, because it integrated new peoples and ideas, and because it preserved knowledge and culture through turbulent times. As we reflect on why Rome really fell, we must move beyond simplistic narratives and embrace the complexity of history. We must recognize that decline and transformation often go hand in hand, and that endings are also beginnings. So, the next time you hear the story of Rome's fall, remember this: it's not just a tale of destruction, but a story of change, survival, and the enduring power of human civilization. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shocking truths historians hide. The fall of Rome is not just history, it's a mirror reflecting the challenges and possibilities of our own time.